Welcome. Good evening. Welcome to Biblical Poetry. And tonight we're going to begin. In some ways, it feels like finally we're turning to the prophets. And I say that with some sort of grand announcement, because the truth is, if you were to ask, well, who are the poets of ancient Israel? Give me a list of the poets of ancient Israel. You might say David, although we've talked about the way that, the Psalms are attributed to David, but, can't all be by him. But the people that you would really start to list, the books that are really books of poetry, entire books of poetry, one after another in the Tanakh, is in that middle section, the books of the prophets. And the prophets, they seem to have received their revelation or spoken their revelation, sort of hard to say, in the form of verse, right? So it really forces us to ask, what is the relationship between the Jewish conception of prophecy and poetry, right? Like, what is it about the poetic form that is the ideal medium for the prophets to work in? Or put the other way, what is it about prophecy that lends itself to poetry? Okay, so we got a lot of poets, we got a lot of prophets to cover. There are 3 major and 12 minor prophets. And we're going to, because I think, I don't know, I like these little 3-unit chunks. I think it's nice to have 3 weeks that we can really kind of wrap our minds around. We're going to spend 3 weeks looking at the major prophets, meaning the heavy hitters, the big ones, the most famous of the prophets. And then we'll break. And I don't know. I actually, after these 3 sessions, maybe we'll do a little poll, because we could keep going through the books of the prophets and really cover them all, the minor prophets. The books, I must say, part of the reason that I wanted to do this class is because these are often books that we don't see, we don't read, and in part we don't read them because they're in verse form, and that makes them harder to like read through than narrative. And so we miss entire books. When's the last time you read Habakkuk? Right? Entire books of our sacred collection here, we never turn to. And so part of the work of this class is to see things that we don't always see. So we could keep going through the books of prophets, or maybe this group will say, whoa, I've had enough. Like, variety is actually what's the engine that's moving us along, and we'll go back to Psalms and we'll look at other things, lots of things to look at. But the truth is, other than the book of Lamentations, which I was just like looking through, what have we not done? Because we've covered some ground. We've looked at some prophecy in the Torah, and we've looked at the Psalms and the books attributed to King Solomon, which is takes us 3 further books into the later collection of writings. But now we're kind of backtracking, and we're going to cover the prophets, and that's the bulk of the remaining books of poetry that we haven't seen yet. So I want to put that out there as just stick a pin in that and say, after these 3 sessions, let's decide if we want to keep going with the prophets. Okay, let's just start tonight with a blessing over Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank God for the Torah and for all the prophets who gave us these beautiful words. Okay, speaking of the Torah, we're going to tonight. I have to mention the Torah right up front, because tonight we're going to look at the greatest of all the prophets. Sometimes you say Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, but of course, that's not true in Jewish tradition. In Jewish tradition, whoa, you don't say the greatest of the prophets about anyone but Moses. Okay, Moses is the greatest of all the prophets. Everything else is just, commentary. Everything else is just extra. But if you don't regard Moses as the greatest of all the prophets, note Christians, Muslims, right? Then when you look at the books of the prophets, it seems that Isaiah really is the standout. Isaiah is the first one listed. Now, I should say the books of the prophets are a little complicated because they begin with narrative books, also supposed to be somehow like prophetically inspired, but when we think of the prophets, we think of these books of poetry, but first you have Joshua, and then you have Judges, and then you have Samuel, and then you have Kings, and that takes you through the story of what happened after the Israelites entered into the land of Israel. And the truth is there's some logic to calling, to lumping them all together, because in those books, there are prophets. We read about some of the characters are prophets, and actually Isaiah is a character in the book of Kings. And that's the first thing that we will learn about Isaiah. Even in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah will announce at what period he lived and prophesied. And we'll soon take a look at that. But Isaiah is the most quoted, the most famous, in some ways the greatest of the prophets. Though again, not for us, second greatest of the prophets, maybe. But with that kind of like, well, number one, but not quite number one in mind, I want to just like give us the first taste of Isaiah, right? Like with Moses in our kind of comparative memory. I want to give you the first taste of Isaiah because Isaiah opens his book with a kind of a dazzling display of what kind of rhetorical power he's going to summon. So let's take a look at that first. Here is a source sheet for you, and I must say I'm a little nervous tonight. How are you going to do the book of Isaiah in an hour? I mean, it's 66 chapters of the towering greatest verse that the Bible has to offer, prophetic verse that the Bible has to offer. So there's just no way to cover it all. And not only that, but I should say that there is a major scholarly debate over who the author of different parts of Isaiah is. And it echoes there's even a traditional debate that seems to divide the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, which seem to take place at the time that we hear them taking place, or that we would assume they took place in the 7th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, meaning like, what is that? The 700s and 600s BCE. And then the latter prophecy seems to be speaking about a later period, but then again, it's prophecy. So like that, from a traditional perspective, that works. But scholars divide up the first 39 and they call it first Isaiah, or Isaiah 1, and then the rest is Isaiah 2. That's also complicated. We're going to mostly look at selections from Isaiah 1 tonight, just so we can like not enter into any of that controversy. It's just too complicated. But that is all to say that it's a lot there's no way I could give you a full sense of Isaiah tonight, but I want to give you at least a couple of important impressions of what he's up to, what is he doing, and then I want to look at just one selection from what I think is just some of the most glorious writing that the Hebrew language has ever produced. So let's just take a look just at the opening line before we get into a further reading. And the opening line is a dazzler, as I say, because we have this introductory, before there's even verse, it's just the vision of Isaiah ben Amoz, Chazon Yeshayahu. The translations here often say the prophecy of Isaiah ben Amoz, but that's not the word in Hebrew. The word in Hebrew is chazon, which is different than prophecy and is a kind of a vision. So the vision that Isaiah ben Amoz who saw visions of Judah and Jerusalem during the reign of Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, and Cheskiah, kings of Judah. Okay, so wait, that's important just to sit and think about. This is a guy who lived during the reigns of all those kings, 4 kings in a row. And that means that he prophesied potentially for decades, 60 years, some say. And also, it's interesting and important because we're about to get into the prophecies that Isaiah lived, one might say, at a time of relative stability, or at least lived at a time when Israel, the kingdom of Israel, was in power. But Isaiah is going to be, being a prophet, is going to speak of a downfall. And that's the other thing that I want to say just by way of introduction to Isaiah, which is that I called this class after one of Isaiah's other famous designations, Isaiah, the prophet of hope. Oh, prophet of hope. And we know that he's the prophet of hope because we know lines like, I'm going to lay down my sword and shield, and I'm not going to study war anymore. What a great word. That's it. That's the world we want. Those lines like that come from Isaiah. My house will be a house of prayer for all people. That's the great visions that Isaiah offers. But you will soon see that Isaiah actually spends, I would say, most of the book talking about how awful things are going to be. And the hope is really only something that emerges afterwards. Or like, and frankly, a lot of it emerges in Isaiah too. Okay, so like you scholars out there, think about that for a minute. But let's just look at the opening. Okay, let's see here. And I apologize. I think I'm going to do a little bit more presenting at first because I want to take us quickly through these first sections, and eventually we're going to look at a random chapter where I just think the language is so beautiful that it's worth looking at. But this is Isaiah's first words here, and they have a kind of a resonance that is quite bold, that some of you I suspect will pick up on. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Eternal has spoken. Okay, just that phrase there, and in Hebrew it's Shimu Shamayim v'hazini aretz. The Hazini Eretz, Ki Hashem Diber. Okay, now, why does that sound familiar? Some of you know.
Didn't Moses say this in the beginning of Deuteronomy?
Yes, very good, very good. Moses says this actually towards the end of Deuteronomy. One of the most famous poems in the Torah is Moses's great speech in Parshat Hazinu. Here, let's take a look at it here. Hazinu means give ear. But Moses, here, I've included it here at the bottom. Moses says, Hazinu hashamayim va'adabera v'tishma ha'aretz imrefi. Give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter. Okay? So, give ear, heavens, and I will speak. The earth, let the earth hear, and then in Isaiah, it's very similar, but a little different. It's hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Eternal has spoken. Now, that's quite something. And maybe I'll just pause here so we can hear a little bit from the group. Isaiah is opening by directly referencing the prophecy of Moses, but sort of flipping around the words. So sort of like exchange, like taking the units. Remember, biblical poetry works in these kind of couplets. And Isaiah kind of, instead of give ear, O heavens, right? It's listen, O heavens. Instead of give ear, O earth, the terms are there, but they're flipped. And instead of me, Moses speaking, Isaiah speaks in the name of God, right? Okay, so there's something just kind of interesting about that. Isaiah sort of shows up and says, I'm going to speak as Moses spoke, but all flipped around, all different, right? Okay, so let me just pause there. Any kind of read on that, on Isaiah's flipping before we move further? Okay. Payam.
I think the difference between Moses and all other prophets is Moses has a conversation with God in essence. And that's why he can use the I voice. I mean, from the other prophets, they're more mouthpieces of like God wants to say stuff to people, so he imbues the prophets to say it for them.
Yeah.
I think it's a different relationship.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. That's a great possible read of this, which is that maybe Isaiah, like any other Jew, recognizes Moses to be sort of the ultimate, the epitome of prophecy. And there's a kind of a deliberate reference, but also a way of saying, I'm going to try to do what Moses did, but it won't be the same. I can't summon the same kind. Maybe there's a kind of acknowledgement like this will be the same but different, right? Okay. Let's just take one more thought. Matt Silverstein.
I didn't keep the Deuteronomy in front of me, but isn't that prose? Isn't that?
No, the Deuteronomy in Parshat Hazinu is also verse.
Okay, then I
If
misread.
I were to click, check this out. If I were to click it, actually, I don't know. Safaria might not. No, Safari's not going to list it in verse form. But this is another one of the few sections of the Torah that's written like a bar. You know, like actual poetry.
I misread it the first time. Never mind.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so let's move forward now. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you some verses from the first chapter and some verses from the second chapter, because for all of the vastness of the book of Isaiah, actually we get a lot just by reading the first and second chapter. Okay, because there's the highs and lows of Isaiah are well encapsulated, or I should say the lows and the highs, because we're going to start low, well encapsulated in the first two chapters. And I'm going to try and highlight the things that we need to know. We're not going to analyze the language so much, and I hope that if we move at the right pace, that we'll be able to really dig in further into the language in the last section that we look at. But let's just look for themes here in this first chapter. And as I said, this Isaiah, who is so famous for his beautiful words that are ascribed on the side of, synagogues and, Capitol buildings everywhere. They're so lofty, they're so beautiful, and yet the first chapter doesn't sound like a prophet of hope, but rather like a prophet of doom. Okay, so let's take a look at the first chapter here. Go back to Isaiah. Okay, so here we are. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Eternal has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, and they have rebelled against me. Banim gidalti veromamti vehem pashubi. An ox knows its owner, a donkey its master's trough. But Israel knows nothing. My people has no consideration. Yada shor konehu v'chamor evos ba'alav. Yisrael lo yada, ami lo hitbonen. Ah, sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, brood of evildoers, depraved children. They have forsaken the Eternal, spurned the Holy One of Israel, turned their backs. Hoi goy choite, am kved avon, zera mereim banim mashchitin. Azvu et Adonai, niatsu et kadosh Yisrael, nazoru achor. Why do you seek further beatings, that you continue to offend? Every head is ailing and every heart is sick. Almet tuku od, tosifu sara kol rosh lecholi, kol levav davai. From the bottom of the foot to the top of the head, no spot is sound, all bruises and welts and raw wounds, not pressed up, not bound up, not softened with oil. Mikaf regel va'ad rosh, ein bo mitom petzav v'chabura umakat triya. Lo zoru v'lo chubashu v'lo rukak. Let's see. Rukkecha v'shemen. Your land is a waste. Your cities burnt down. Your ground is consumed before you by strangers. a wasteland overthrown by strangers. Artechem shemama, arechem srufot esh, admatchem lenegdechem zarim ochlim ota, ushmama kema pechat zarim. Fair Zion is left like a shack in a vineyard, like a hut in a cucumber field, like a city beleaguered. V'notra bat Zion kesuka v'kerem, kimlon'a v'mishka, ke'ir nitzura. Had not the Eternal of Legions left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom, just like another Gomorrah. Lule Adonai tzvaot hotir lanu sarid kim'at kisdom hayinu la'amora daminu. Hear the word of the Eternal, you captains of Sodom. Give ear to our God's instructions, you folk of Gomorrah. Shim'u devar Adonai kitzine sdom. Hazinu Torat Eloheinu am amora. What need have I of all of your sacrifices, says the Eternal. I am sated with burnt offerings of rams, the suet of fatlings and blood of bulls, and I have no delight in lambs and goats. Lamali rov zivchehem, Yomar Adonai. Savati olot elim v'chelev mereim, v'dam parim ukvasim v'atudim lo chafatzti. That you come to appear before me. Who asked that of you? Trample my courts no more. Kitavo leraot panai, mi bikesh zot miyedchem, remos chatzerai. Bringing oblations is futile. Incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbath, proclaiming of solemnities, assemblies with iniquity I cannot abide. Lo tosifu havi min shav, ketoret toeva hili, chodesh v'shabbat, kro mikra, lo uchal aven v'atzara. Your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They are become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. Chodshechem uadechem, san'a nafshi, hayu alai litroach, nil'eti naso. And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen. Your hands are stained with crime. Uvefarischem kapechem alim einai gam ki tarbu tefila eineni shomea. Yedechem damim maleu. Wash yourselves clean. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Rachatsu, hizaku, hasiru roa mi'alalechem, mineged einai, chidlu harea. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Aid the wrong. Uphold the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow. Limdu heitev, dirshu mishpat, ashru chamotz, shiftu yatom, rivu almana. Okay, so there is a little taste of the dark side of Isaiah. And I read that whole selection in part because I want you to see not just the heavy language, the sort of the very severe condemnations, hoi goy choteh, you sinful nation, but also the descriptions of a land in waste. That's part of the Isaiah prophecy. And the disdain for the sacrifices. Okay, this is an important theme in the prophets that Isaiah is the first to pick up on, that I, in the name of God, don't want any more of your sacrifices. In fact, says Isaiah, I don't even want your prayers. I won't listen to your prayers. And what is the solution? The solution is that you must stop being evil and learn to do good and seek justice. Okay? So that is the solution. The solution is that we must be good. We must seek good, seek justice. We must defend the cause of the widow and the orphan. That's the solution. What is the problem? Like, can we speak that out a little bit? Oh, you're a terrible, sinful nation. But what is the problem that Isaiah is identifying? Why is Isaiah so angry? Because after all, I mean, they must have asked then, Isaiah, we're doing fine. Everything's fine. There's the temple stands. Why are you so agitated? Okay, Emil Stern, what do you think?
I mean, I actually wonder about this every year on Yom Kippur because we read something similar, right? Like you're there fasting, and then it's like, why do you fast? What is this to me? This is nothing, you know. And like, it seems like the problem is keeping ritual biblical commandments, right, without actually caring about the poor and the hungry and the needy and the, you know. So yeah, this is fascinating because it's like a standing question for me. It's like we're doing the thing, and it's like, no, you're not. Like, you're not doing the thing.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. That's a very, very keen read there, because and Emil reminds us that in a later chapter echoes this sentiment, and the sentiment is all of the rituals of Jewish life, right? Which frankly the rabbis have sort of embraced, and is now they're now sort of inextricable from our tradition. All the rituals of Jewish life, Isaiah seems to be saying, not interested. Sacrifices, okay, we're fine when he says that. We don't like the sacrifices so much nowadays. But he doesn't, all of this stuff, all of the religiosity, Isaiah's not interested in that, because the hypocritical performance of ritual betrays a kind of ethical carelessness, an ethical wretchedness. And so Isaiah comes to represent and sort of set the tone for what we think of now as the prophetic tradition, which is a tradition more concerned with ethics than it is with law. And that is why all those who have tried to move away from the legalistic paradigm in Jewish tradition have celebrated the prophets. That's true for Christians in their sort of move away from the law of Moses, and it's also true for the Reform movement, which really emerged as a kind of reclaiming of the prophetic tradition, right? The early Reformed Jews often did not study the Talmud so much because they weren't as interested in the rabbinic legalistic approach to the religion, but they put renewed emphasis on the prophets, who likewise seemed uninterested in the legal tradition and focused on the ethical core. Do good, seek justice. And you can talk about justice without talking about law, right? That's one of the great insights of the prophets. Okay, any other thoughts before we saw the dark side? We're about to see the light side of Isaiah. Any other sort of thoughts on what is it that Isaiah is so agitated about? Jonathan?
Yeah, I always struggle with this sort of sentiment that the sort of the religious observance doesn't matter if the ethical observance isn't there. Not that I think that's not true. I think it is true, but I struggle to find the bright line in terms of like, how bad do you have to be before you're evil? How good do you have to be before you're good? And at what point can you then proceed to these religious observances and for Isaiah to be comfortable with you doing that? I don't know that an answer is immediately apparent from the text, but I would propose in the prophetic readings, and I think also the rabbinical readings of a lot of these stories, that they really do mean, like, if there is one single widow who is not taken care of, if there's one single orphan who's not taken care of in your society, you live in a failed society, which is like so radically different from what we can even conceive of in America in 2021.
Yeah. So I heard some good cautionaries there in Yonatan's reflections, and one of them is, look, Isaiah probably was an anti-law, right? Like, but he is worried about the hypocrisy, and Yonatan asks some really important questions, like, how bad do you have to be? What is it that Isaiah is so frustrated with? And it seems to, as Yonatan suggests, it seems to be the standard is very high. And yet, I feel like, no. I mean, the world he's describing seems like it's in total chaos, total disarray. But that wasn't true. So then Yonatan's comments become all the more insightful. Like, Isaiah's living at a time of relative tranquility and prosperity and seemingly success, but he's seeing the way that certain people are not being cared for in this society, exactly as we might do in our own society today, where we live, you know, in this place of abundance, and yet people are sleeping on the streets, right? And you can imagine Isaiah saying, something is deeply wrong here. And imagine just that, going out into the streets, seeing someone lying in the streets and saying, this country is going to hell. I can tell, and nobody else sees it. right? Okay, so that's part of the vibe here. I'm gonna, Florine, I'm gonna come back to you. I want to, just for pace sake, I want to look at the chapter 2, just so we haven't done a lot of linguistic work, and that this is a poetry class after all, and we have to kind of get a running start with these massive prophetic traditions, but I do want to get eventually to real poetic analysis. The section that I want to turn to next, though, just to give us a full picture of Isaiah, and after all, some of you must be scratching your heads like, this is Isaiah? And that's how I feel every time I open the book. I'm like, oh my gosh, that first chapter is a real like just a bomb. This is like a real doozy. And then suddenly you turn to the second chapter. It doesn't take long. Turn to the second chapter and that's Isaiah. That's the Isaiah I want. And by the way, I would love your feedback. I'm trying to do more highlighting when I read, to like highlight what I'm reading. It's a little, and I can't tell what you're seeing. So I love suggestions about how to make the Zoom experience work more effectively for you. So anytime someone has suggestions, put them in the chat or write them to me personally. I'm trying to figure out how to make this as easy an experience to ingest visually. But I'm experimenting with highlighting, which I haven't always done. It's a little complicated. Okay, but let's take a look now at chapter 2. Okay, and chapter 2, interestingly, repeats a kind of introduction as if to say, oh yeah, so what was that vision? I mean, there's a vision of destruction right up here, the vision of Isaiah, and then we repeat, there's a new vision, a vision that Isaiah ben Amos saw of Al Yehud of Yerushalayim. Okay. It will be at the end of days that the mount of the house of the Eternal shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills, and all the nations will flow towards it. Haya ba'achrit hayamim nachon yehar beit Adonai berosh harim, v'nisa migvaot v'naharu elav kol hagoyim. And the many peoples will go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Eternal, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may instruct us in God's ways, and that we may walk in God's paths. For Torah shall come forth from Zion, the word of the Eternal from Jerusalem. V'alchu amim rabim v'amru, lechu v'na'aleh el har Adonai el beit Elohei Yaakov, v'yorenu midrachav v'neilcha ba'orchotav, ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Adonai miYerushalayim. That line should be familiar to you. And God will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation, and never again shall they study war. V'shafat bein hagoyim v'hochiach la'amim rabim v'chittu charvotam le'itim v'chanitotehem lemazmerot lo yisagoy el goy cherev v'lo yimadu od milchama. Right? We all want to start singing. Okay, so that's Isaiah. Ain't gonna study war no more. I love it. A world of peace, a world redeemed, and what? But let's just work it out. We just got a very dark picture of the world, and then all of a sudden Isaiah says, but b'achrita yamim, in the days to come, at the end of days, tada. What's the tada? What is Isaiah's great vision? What's his ultimate vision? Okay, that question I put out there, but I'm not asking Florine to answer it. I turn back to Florine, who had thoughts from before.
What I think is so very sad is that there was and still is among some people, a misunderstanding of ritual. Ritual is a clarification, a purification for us to go out and be part of holiness and do holiness. And it's as if it was seen as something totally disconnected from holiness.
Great. So that
I have a problem with that today with some people still.
Yeah, so that does remain, we're turning this over a little bit with Yonatan as well. There remains a question around what Isaiah's vision actually is. Is Isaiah saying, almost like a proto-Reform Jew, like the laws are not what's important is the core? Or is Isaiah saying something else? Is Isaiah saying, don't forget the core of the law, that the law is meant to actually communicate these values? And of course you should do the law, and of course we should worship, and of course all this, but it's all meaningless if you don't have that ethical, so it's hypocrisy that he's pointing out, but not a condemnation of ritual of law itself. So that's a good question, and it raises the other question, the bigger question we're asking here, which is, what is Isaiah's vision? What's his? All the nations go up to the temple and they're all no study. I mean, I guess, I don't know, world peace, right? Like, did anyone want to nuance that any further? What is Isaiah seeing here? Florian, you want to keep going?
Yeah,
Go for it.
It's messianic. That's it. If we all got on the bandwagon and did beautiful things and brought goodness into the world, other nations would join us, hopefully. And then we would have a messianic age.
Okay, that's great. That's great. I didn't expect that word to pop up, but that's the right word. The truth is, like, there's a lot about Isaiah's vision that is messianic, that is about a world redeemed. And in fact, Isaiah speaks a lot of some figure that will arise, tzemach, that will sprout up from the stump and will be the person who will bring us into this. What Christians do with Isaiah is remarkable. I mean, there's just like, they see Jesus everywhere in Isaiah, right? It's like a bedrock text for Christians, because they see him prophesying the coming of Jesus. And it's because the book is laden with this kind of like, it's all going to go to hell, but then something's coming, right? And that's part of what I want us to be thinking about here, as we just saw the dark side of Isaiah, and now we're seeing the bright side of Isaiah. And part of what I'm asking you to make sense of is, like, what is that movement? What does it mean for Isaiah to say things are going to get awful and then they're going to get better? Here's what's wrong. Here's what will be good. Here's the vision of the future that will be terrible, and then here's the vision of the ultimate future that will be great. Like, there's a kind of a movement there that Isaiah is trying to get us to envision along with him. What is that movement? Shep, resonant?
So I think it's a contrast between these two sections. In the first section, Isaiah is saying, we are doing this wrong. We're focusing on all the wrong things. We're coming to the mountain and we're focusing on these rituals, whether it's the blood of the animals that we're killing without intention for the sake of checking the box, or the blood of the people that we're killing by pushing them off the ramp as we are seeking to get past them. There's blood on our hands. We're losing the point. At the end of days, once we go through this process of learning, we won't need the active strategies and war to learn about, in terms of knocking off your fellow colleague off the ramp so you get there first, because we've all found a way to come there together to worship that which is greater than ourselves. So whether it's Christianity or Judaism, we are talking about a coming together of people with that which is greater than ourselves, which may just be us coming together with other people, and God isn't necessarily at the table, and that's enough for God.
Okay, Chef just did, I think, a remarkable, I've never thought about this reading of one of the verses that we just looked at. Yidechem damim maleu, your hands are filled with blood, right? And I also thought, like, oh, I guess you're murderers, but right, we just read about all these sacrifices, but so maybe it's the sacrifices, but Chef says, no, it's clearly both. It's meant to land as your hands are stained with blood because people are dying, and meanwhile, you're mucking around with the blood of the animals. You're not getting it. You're not getting it, right? And eventually you'll go up to this mountain. The mountain is still there. The temple is still there, presumably. But you understand the right relationship to the blood of the sacrifices, but also to the blood of your fellow human being. Miriam, Safti?
Yeah, I think he's saying that we have a chance for teshuvah. He's telling us we did all these bad things, and now God is allowing you to go back and redo your ways. And there's teshuvah. He gave us a gift of teshuvah. And in the end, if we learn from our bad ways, we can be redeemed.
I think that's right. That's one great way of describing the movement. I asked, what is the movement? It's like going to get bad and then it's going to get good. And Isaiah says it's going to get bad and then you're going to have to learn something from that.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Your shu mishpat, seek out justice. Right? You're not going to learn war. You're going to learn other things. You have to learn the lessons of this, and you have to repent. And that's how we get to this era. Now, I want to just add something that hasn't come up yet, which is that this era is good, and it's in Jerusalem, and Torah is coming, but it's also like distinctly this era is universal, right? All of the nations come up to Jerusalem. All of the people recognize God. Let us go, and everybody seems to be happy. But it's universal, but it's also very particularistic, right? It's all everybody comes and everybody's unified, but everybody recognizes that Jerusalem is at the center of it all, right? So like if you do the work to become a people worthy of this, then the world will be redeemed and you'll be like right at the center of it. I just want to add that because that imagery of all the nations is also a part of Isaiah's vision. All right, I'll take one comment from Kathy Kobayashi and then we'll look at our last text, which is really in some ways our text of the evening. Kathy?
Yeah, I guess I don't find the good part quite as good or satisfying as hopeful. I mean, part of it is because I think, okay, so the bad part is not just, oh, these are, hypocritical sacrifices and everything. I was really struck that that it even talks about time. The new moon and the Sabbath, I cannot abide. I cannot endure them. The new moon and the fixed seasons are a burden to me. It's like time itself. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, you're behaving badly or your intentions are bad, but just to say that, time itself is a burden and, and unendurable. And then when you get presumably to the good part, the hopeful part, what I was really struck with was the end of days. This isn't saying, oh yeah, if you start behaving better, things are going to get better. This is like the end of days, the end of time, it's beyond time. And so it's like, it's way out there. And so it's not clear to me. It's really saying, oh, take care of people and change your behavior. And then things, it's like, it's something about time.
Yeah, that's
really big.
You're sketching out something very important and you're kind of leaving it with an ellipsis, which I will do too, because it's a little hard to say, especially in our short time, like what is the concept of time that is operative in the prophetic vision? But there is something like Isaiah is living at a time of relative stability. He looks forward and he sees, first of all, what does it mean to be a prophet? What does it mean to see that the world will actually come undone? And then to say, but there's an ultimate vision. And it's not even clear. I'm sort of wondering as Kathy's describing it, is Isaiah saying, and then 50 years after the exile, you'll all come back? No, or is he saying, yeah, things are going to get bad. I believe one day, ... Like there's something about it that almost feels like it's so far out there that it's like it's having hope. He is a prophet of hope, but it's hope that despite all of the disaster I see in front of me, I hope. Despite all, so there's a kind of like, everything that Kathy is saying feels very important because there's something precise about Isaiah's predictions and also something very kind of vast and unknowable about the timeline that he's sketching. Okay. Now I want to look, I was like, so I had these two chapters and I was like, but I want to give you all some sense of just this isn't just a class in Isaiah after all, this is a class in poetry, and I want to give you a sense of just how good Isaiah's poetry is. And the I like went through, and the chapter that I landed on is another dark side of Isaiah chapter. So I'm going to end on kind of a bump. Like I wanted to give you the uplifting chapters, just really the noble vision. But after all, Isaiah devoted himself as much to the vision of doom and destruction as he did to the vision of hope and redemption. And boy, did he devote himself. Look, I mean, I hope that even in reading the Hebrew, you will gain some sense of just like we saw in the opening where he flips around Moses's words, Isaiah is a master of the Hebrew language and of the tradition that's gone before him. And we're going to see him play with language in a way that I have to admit, I don't have a lot of thoughts on the meaning of what we're going to see. I'll leave that to you because I just wanted you to hear the sound of these words. So we're turning now to chapter 24. And just as a setup for it, I will tell you, for those kind of poetry fans out there, that when I read chapter 24, I couldn't help but think of the Isaiah seems to be doing something here much earlier that William Butler Yeats does many centuries later in the famous poem, The Second Coming. So I want to read just an excerpt from that first, hear the modern version, and then we'll go back and hear Isaiah do it better, dare I say? All right, so just look at the Yeats here. It's a famous poem talking about some of the chaos that is present in modernity. And then we'll go and look at that same chaos in the ancient world. Here's Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. It's a great poem. It's a great poem. But okay, so the chaos that is about to be loosed on the world, yeah, that isn't going to be loosed on the world in the 20th century. Right? That's going to be loosed on the world in the 6th century BCE, it turns out, right? Because here's Isaiah's kind of version of that, and I'm going to try and read the Hebrew, with slowly enough that you really get a sense of the rhythm of the language here. So let's take a look at Isaiah's vision of anarchy. Okay. The language here in the Hebrew is really something to behold. So here, it's hard to jump back and forth, so I'm just gonna highlight the English, but I'll read the Hebrew after. Okay, behold, the Eternal will strip the earth bare and lay it to waste, and twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. Hine Adonai bokek haaretz uvolka, v'iva faneha vehefitz yoshveha. The people along with the priests, the slave along with his master, the maid along with her mistress, the buyer along with the seller, the lender along with the borrower, the creditor along with the debtor. Vaya cha'am ka'kohen, ka'eved ka'adonav, ka'shivcha ka'virta, ka'koneh ka'mocher, ka'malveh ka'loveh, ka'noshe ka'asher noshebo. The earth shall be bare, bare. It shall be plundered, plundered. For it is the Eternal who spoke this word. Hibok tibok haaretz, v'hiboz tiboz, ki Adonai diber et hadavar hazeh. The earth is withered, seared. The earth languishes, it is seared. The most exalted people of the earth languish. Avla navla haaretz. Umlala navla tevel, umlalu merom am haaretz. For the earth was defiled under its inhabitants, because they transgressed the teachings, violated laws, broke the ancient covenant. V'haaretz chanfa tachat yoshveha, ki avru torot chalfu chok, heferu brit olam. That's why a curse consumes the earth, and its inhabitants pay the penalty. That is why the earth's dwellers have dwindled, and but few people are left. Al kain Allah achla eretz v'yeshmu yoshvei al kain charu yoshvei eretz v'nishar enosh nizar. Okay, and then we're going to jump and just, here's a few lines from the end. And again, I just wanted to pick up on some of the, you hear the repetition here, you hear the use of language here, but I'm going to pause in the middle of this and point out some of the really exquisite playfulness that Isaiah is engaged in here, even as he damns everything in his sight. From the far corner of the earth, we hear singing, glory to the righteous. And I say, I waste away, I waste away. Woe is me, the faithless have acted faithlessly, the faithless have broken faith. Mikanaf haaretz zemirot shamanu tzvi latzadik. Va'omar, razili, razili, oili, bogdim bagadu, uveged bogdim bagadu. That language right there is just astounding. The traitors have betrayed, and the appearance or the clothing of the traitors have betrayed. Just like these 5 words here, bogdim bagadu, uveged bogdim bagadu. And then it follows up with pachad v'fachad v'fach alecha yoshev haaretz. Now, the Hebrew here, right, you'd have to know the Hebrew to see how exquisite this was, but you can see even visually, terror and pit and trap are all words that begin with the same consonant. Pachad v'fachat v'fach alecha yoshev haaretz. Terror and pit and trap upon you who dwell on the earth. And then this line, which takes all of these units and then plays with them. And the one who flees at the sound of terror shall fall into the pit. And the one who climbs out of the pit shall be caught in the trap. For the chambers are opened on high, and the earth's foundations tremble. Vahaya hanas mikol hapachad yipol el hapachat. V'ha'oleh mitoch hapachat yilaked bapach. Ki arubot mimarom niftachu v'yirashu mosdei aretz. The earth is breaking, breaking. The earth is crumbling, crumbling. The earth is tottering, tottering. Ro'ah hitro'ah ha'aretz. Por yitporara eretz. Mot hitmotata aretz. The earth is swaying like a drunkard. It is rocking to and fro like a hut. Its crimes shall weigh it down, and it shall fall to rise no more. Noah tanua eretz. Kashikor v'hitnodeda kamalona. V'chavad aleha pish'a v'nafla v'lo tasif kum. Okay. Kind of a bummer, I admit, but the language there is so unbelievable, so exquisite, so like, how does he do it even? Just like turning and turning, and there is like, he's describing a kind of a motion, a kind of a chaos that the language sort of does some work in mapping out. There's a kind of like circling, gyring, right, to borrow from Yeats. So I want to end with that question. Here is another description of a world just sort of in shambles, and Isaiah's description of it is so linguistically lofty. And I want to just ask you, I want to turn to you and anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak, otherwise I'll call on people for the second time, and I want to just ask you, what do you make of this language? What does the language do for the vision? How does the poetry affect the prophecy? Okay, so I'd love to take thoughts on that. Yael.
One of the things that was jumping out at me is the onomatopoetic nature of it. It sounded like rocks, boulders, falling and clunking on each other and on everyone in the vicinity. And the last part of what you read to me almost sounded like the dust that remains after all these boulders are crunching down on everything, and it's all that remains is this dust.
I love that. I love that description. The boulders kind of like boz ti boz.
Yeah.
Ti boz ti boz. Pach, v'pachad, v'pach, right? Like the cram, bang, 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 and then it's like the words themselves lay waste to the landscape. I love that description. Okay. Anyone else that hasn't spoken yet? Susan Black-Feinstein. Nice to see you, Susan.
Nice to see you too. This is just a little insane, but I enjoy the sound of Hebrew. I've always enjoyed it, even stuff that I didn't understand. But as you were speaking in Hebrew and in English, you know, the transliteration shows up under the screen, and some of the Hebrew transliteration into English letters was so amusing and funny. And like the last 3 words that you said in Hebrew came out, lotus, safe, cool, whatever. I don't know. You can look at, but I wrote down what it sounded like to me. You know what they wrote. They wrote lotus, safe, cool.
That's great.
So it's a little unnerving for me to not only listen to the Hebrew, but then see the transliteration at the bottom of the screen. But otherwise, I mean, whoever is typing this, is this mechanical or is it a human being?
Yeah, it's mechanical. Thanks for highlighting that, Susan. That's right. We have this live transcript feature now, which I've been mentioning lately, and anyone can use it. I'm especially excited because, you know, my mother's been able to join these recent spate of classes because she's using it. But of course, it is the case that like as every other word I say is in Hebrew, and then it shows up in some I think Bereshit was like barbecue rub the other night. But it's great. Actually, the truth is, in a poetry class, this is like great. We're like in the realm of experimental poetry, you know, like what are the words that come out as a kind of a machine this is like kind of like John Cage style, like, you know, poetic composition here. So I love that. I love that. And yeah, like, again, I've said this several times, but I do want to just like spread the word that Zoom has this now, and that our classes, Mom says she gets about 75%, right? About 75% more. 99. It's getting better. It's getting better as she's learning how to use it. So, you know, I hope it's a good tool for people to use. Okay, great. We are almost out of time. Let's just take a couple of last comments before we close. And again, we're asking the question, all that language, and Yael answered so beautifully. What is it doing to help us see this vision? Yael imagined the language being boulders crashing. Susan's description was also helpful because it's like everything is really coming undone and becoming kind of nonsense here, right? That's also part of the vision. Let me turn back to Emil Stern.
It's kind of ecstatic. He's really looking forward to this. Like, he just wants everything to be wiped off the face of the planet. Like a great storm will come, you know, and it's this kind of like the repetition and the euphonia. Like it's this kind of, it's like this euphoric kind of state that he's working himself into, you know. And when you like read descriptions of what prophecy used to look like people staying naked in the river, right? And the whole, you know, like you can totally picture this person working himself to an ecstasy. But I guess my question is like, what is his problem? Like, is his problem the people, or is his problem the ritual itself? Or is it like that we're not getting we're not getting what we should out of the ritual? Or is it just like how radical is this? Like, is he talking back to the Torah, or is he talking to the people, and he cannot wait for them to be like, you know, taken care of?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So, I mean, first of all, I think Emil is right in giving us another way of seeing this language, which is just like, Emil says he's almost enjoying it, right? Roah hit roah, por hit porah, right? Like there's a kind of like, you can see he's in his prophetic mode, and there is this way in which even as prophets, we imagine the prophet standing on the street corner, maybe sounding like a lunatic, but completely consumed by his vision. Remember, the prophetic spirit we describe in the Hebrew Bible as seizing someone, taking a hold of someone. Right? And so we're imagining that this poetry is just sort of like spitting out of him, coming out of him in a state of ecstasy. I think Emil described that well. But Emil leaves us with a question, right, that I think is worth asking. And we could ask it of Yates also, right? Like, what is the force that is undoing the world? because so far we've been thinking about the human failing, maybe the Israelite failing, our own transgressions, our own ethical failures. But there is also in this description a kind of like the world just falling apart, right? The earth is breaking, the earth is crumbling, the earth is tottering, swaying like a drunkard. It almost seems like the earth has its own chaotic, volatilic force, right? I think probably just volatile. But it's a little bit like this. The center cannot hold. Like there's something about existence itself that is just like, it can't contain itself. It's spinning out of control. And I think Emil's question is right. Like the diagnosis of why, I mean, the easy answer are sins. But is there more? Is there something else that Isaiah is describing that is like, right? That is fundamental maybe to existence itself. Okay, we're over time tonight, so I think I better end it there. But I would like not to leave you with a bummer. You know, I would like to not leave you with a world in chaos. So so far we've only looked at Isaiah 1, but in chapter 40, scholars say another Isaiah begins, and part of the reason they say that is because suddenly in chapter 40 things begin to lift. And it's from these chapters that we borrow some of the traditional readings that we do every summer, the Shiva Nedechamta, the 7 readings of consolation. And they begin with this beautiful line so for all of the chaos we've been describing, don't forget that Isaiah, at least one version of Isaiah, it's either Isaiah himself or some midrash on Isaiah, and I'm fine with either. Isaiah is famous for lines like this last one here. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and declare to her that her term of service is over and that her iniquity is expiated. Right? Nachamu, nachamu ami, yoimar Elohechem, davru alev Yerushalayim, Dikiru eleha. So Isaiah is also the one that comforts us from his own vision, Right? Isaiah is complicated. Isaiah has a lot going on in it. But I'll just say in closing that, you know, Isaiah is the one who has like been damning the world all along. And if you look at that last line, it almost sounds like God has had enough. Right? Like, what are you doing, Isaiah? Comfort my people. That's not Isaiah's people. That's God's people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem. Call out to Jerusalem. Stop yelling at them. Right? Stop depressing them. Like, let's end this book with a little bit of comfort, right? And thus the last 20 chapters of Isaiah begin to build and then go back and remind us of our sins and then give us that hope and then damnation and then hope. And that's the rhythm of Isaiah, who is known as a prophet of hope, but it is hope that only emerges in the midst of a recognition of total disaster. And I have to say, I think, and Yonatan was hinting at this earlier, that is a vision we need to keep in mind today, right? We need to be aware, we need to really know what is wrong with our society and where it is headed before we ever begin to envision how our society can be redeemed from that. So thank you all for being here. And next week we will pick up with the prophet of doom, who's actually known as the prophet of doom, Jeremiah. Okay, so join me on this tour through the major prophets, and thanks all for your learning tonight. Thanks to Andrea for running the show. Good night, everyone.